I think we're recording now. So Robert, I know you're a main man. This is like the second time you're gonna be asked a bunch of questions about this book from members of the Black faculty and staff here at Brooklyn College. Just for people who don't know me, my name is David Wells. I'm the director of the Black and Latino Male Initiative here at Brooklyn College, responsible for three, retention, recruitment, and graduation of a Black and Latino population. It's predominantly male, but we're open to everyone. Rob, I think it's important for me really to to be here today and given this opportunity to talk about black male, sort of like black queerness from your perspective of the way you wrote this book, but also because the issue of black maleness and the idea of freedom, a lot of that pervades through this book. I'm really excited just to talk to you about, you know, what were you thinking writing this book? So, I don't think I have to introduce you again because most people know you. But what I want to do start off with straight off the top of the bat is like, yo, how did your experience of black queerness really influence the writing of this book?
You know, I don't think I could have written this book if I was not, if I didn't exist at the intersection of blackness and queerness. It puts me in maybe not a unique position, but a interesting position, such that as a black person, I experience a particular brand of racism, anti-blackness from the world. And what complicates that is that I'm also a queer person. So I experience anti queerness from the world. And what that means is that places where I thought I would be safe, I'm not. Because while I have this in common with this group, this other thing makes me different. And so, and that difference is interpreted as inferiority. And as a result of that, and many Black queer people can tell you this, you don't know where your safe space is. You cannot dwell in white spaces because of your Blackness. You cannot dwell in Black spaces because of your queerness. So you're trapped in this like liminal danger, um, dangerous place. So what that affords the Black queer person is a unique perspective, maybe, on the ways in which oppressions operate, and how even oppressed groups will oppress others because white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is such a seductive reasoning tool. Um, I can feel valuable or special if someone is less than me. So who is so different from me that I can make them less than me? Toni Morrison put it this way. She said, if you can only be tall because someone is on their knees, then you have a very serious problem. And that is what happens to us when we operate in this paradigm of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. We can only feel tall when other people are on their knees. That's where we get our value from. We can't look people in the eye. We have to look down at them to feel special or valuable. And in the prophets, um, I'm afforded this ability to go back to some basics about where do we learn this from? Like, why do we operate this way? And why do we think that this is the right way to be? We have such strong convictions about the Black queer figure. Like we really believe in our spirituality, in our DNA, in our bones, that there is something inherently depraved, inherently inferior, inherently sinful about queerness, but in particular the Black queer figure, because um, many people in Black communities think that queerness is a result of slavery, that Black men in particular are queer because they were raped by white slave owners who were trying to subjugate them, make them submit, emasculate them, and such. But the prophets explores the falsity of that notion, which I think comes out of this idea that masculinity equals power. And if you are anything that's feminine or queer or whatever, you can't be masculine and therefore you can't have power. And the only way to fight back against white supremacy is to have like this strength and this power. And women and gay men in particular are a threat to that. So having grown up as a Black queer person, those messages have been thrown at me since almost since birth. And so this was a place to kind of explore that pathology.
Yo, I swear, as you were speaking, I got so many questions just popping up. You spoke a little bit about, you know, people thinking about Black men queer because of being raped by the slave masters and stuff like that. And I know there was one point where Sarah jumped in and it was telling Samuel, not Samuel, she was telling Isaiah, and sorry for people who didn't reach that part yet, that what you all have ain't nothing new. And she was alluding to her because she was from Africa. She was taken from Africa, if I remember properly. And she
Yes.
was alluding to the fact that this been going on in Africa, which contradicts, what the stereotype. And I know for a fact that even though this is fiction, it's really based on research, historical research. So I guess I'm curious then, like, if you could talk about your research that you did on this idea of the history of Black queerness.
Sure. As a Black queer person, you always feel the need to prove that you have a right to exist because so many of our institutions, the Black church, Black families, as well as the white church, white families, the overall structure of colonial powers tells you that you don't have a right to exist. And so you start to internalize and believe those sorts of things. So you hear these stories about the only reason why you're not cisgender heterosexuals because you were corrupted, and that you're supposed to be straight, but something traumatic and make to knock you off of your path of straightness, which is righteousness. But upon doing the research, and I did research through the traditional channels of going to the library, finding books on the sort of the way in which queerness shows up in history. But I also did some non-traditional research, which is I went to the oral histories of continental Africans. And I'll give you one example of that. I listened to Esther Arma, who is from Ghana, and she's a brilliant activist, thinker, scholar. And she talked about how misunderstandings between the cultures happen. She said if you had asked her great grandparents, who were from the Ga tribe, if I remember correctly, if you had asked them, do you have any homosexuals in your village? They would have said, no, we don't even know what that is. And Westerners asked that question and took from it, there were no homosexuals in ancient Africa. And Esther explained, you would have been wrong. The problem, the breakdown in communication would have been that in these tribes, in these villages, there was no need to distinguish relationships as heterosexual, homosexual, because it was all considered a part of nature. So if a man loved a man, if a woman loved a woman, if a man loved a woman, if a woman loved a man, if somebody was non-binary or transgender, there was no need to give those things categories and titles. they thought it was just all a part of nature. And there was no need to separate this person from me because they're transgender, or this person from me because they're queer. They all existed. And so we took on this idea that, oh, if you don't have a name for it, that means it did not exist. And that was wrong. It wasn't until European colonizers, Christian missionaries, Islamic missionaries came into these regions, into these cities and villages, that the notion that these things were wrong, that's where it comes from. Because Christians looked at this and said, this is sodomy. This isn't right. You can't do this. It's supposed to be man and woman. And through the sheer force of their power, they conquered these places. They forced these beliefs onto us, and now we think these beliefs that were not ours, that are foreign to us, we as Black people think these are ours, and we embrace it wholeheartedly, even stronger now than white people embrace these ideas. And that's what happens when you're indoctrinated.
It's funny as you said that. I always looked at Amos as this character, Samuel Jackson character in Django, but as you just mentioned, as you explained, from the historian from Ghana, and how it was Christianity who caused us to blame, to put right or wrong on the sexuality of a person. That's what Amos is. And it's now I fully understand Amos's character. Like I said, I just thought he was like, Samuel Jackson from Django, trying to be like the master's best friend.
I did not want to make Amos like Django. Like that's Django, to that character in Django is so flat. There's no explanation for why that character is the way he is.
Mm-hmm.
What I wanted to make clear was Amos actually loves Samuel and Isaiah. He's placed in a precarious and difficult position where he has to protect one person by throwing two others under the bus. My friend Darnell Moore says, when you have crabs in a barrel, the problem is not the crabs, it's the barrel. And so the barrel is this plantation. It's this system that Paul set up. That's the problem. And Amos is trying to navigate that system as best he can in ways that are extremely problematic, but also happen every day. Like Black people to this day have to navigate these systems in ways that are not always clean and noble and wonderful in order to survive.
Mm. And I want to go back to something you spoke about: man loving woman, woman loving woman. And I'll be honest with you, when you said King Akusa, and I have to make sure I don't say Queen Akusa, and you were talking about the wires, I guess looking at it from this sort of like European perspective, I'm like, a king is a man, and so it was confusing. So I'm curious to know, like, what impact you wanted that character to have on the readers, because I'm telling you what it had on me. I was like, what's going on?
And with intention, I said, I'm not going to explain
Good.
that King Akusa, this king happens to be a woman. I'm just going to write it, and I'm going to use she pronouns. And everybody who has read that, who has talked to me about it, had said they had to go, wait a minute, and go back, because they did not, they saw king and they assumed male.
Mm-hmm.
But in the before time in Africa, all over the continent, king was just a title. King was, it was in various languages, because there are hundreds of languages on the continent of Africa, so it wasn't exactly the word king, but that position, whoever held it, it didn't matter if it was a man, a woman, a non-binary person, or whatever. That was just the title. It had nothing to do with one's gender or sexuality or genitals. It was the name of the job. Like it's like, for example, doctor. You don't call women doctors doctoress. You say doctor. It's just a title. Europe really impressed upon um, not just Black indigenous peoples, but indigenous peoples all over the world, this idea that things should be separated by gender. But that's not our original ways of thinking in very many places in the continent. And I used that situation with King Akusa to sort of drive home the point at how different we used to think about things as African people and the ways in which we've been indoctrinated to think about things as being colonized by Europeans.
Ah, as you say, there's this thing pops up to me, and something that stood out to me in the book was when you spoke about, you created a spectrum of, I don't know if it's masculinity or manhood, but when Sarah was talking about Samuel and Isaiah, and she was like, yo, Samuel is a man, I know he's a man, but Isaiah, I'm not sure if he's a woman or if he's just free. Can you talk about that piece? Because that was like, it's something that stood out to me in the book, and I'm like, I gotta ask Robert about this.
One of the interesting things I learned during my research of the before time in Africa was the ways in which various indigenous populations dealt with the idea of gender. For example, in Nigeria, even now, the languages of Nigeria don't have pronouns. They don't have like gender specific pronouns. There's no he or she in indigenous Nigerian languages. Or in Ghana, when a child is born, or back then at least in ancient Ghana, when a child was born, there was no assigning of gender because they felt like you couldn't know the gender because the genitals is not the thing that tells us whether you're a man or you're a woman or you're non-binary or whatever. It's your spirit. And we won't know your spirit until you're much older. So they had rituals where, you turn, I'm not sure that this is the age, but let's say you turn 20. That was when you decided if you were a man, a woman, or something else. And so having learned all of these things, I wanted to bring all of these ideas into the book so that I could illustrate see how different ways there are to think about these things. Because we as Americans, as Westerners, we think the way that we think about reality is the way it should be. We think it's absolutely irrefutable, scientific. If you have a penis, you're a man. If you have a vagina, you're a woman, period. And the world is so much more complex than that. And our ancestors had a much more complex and future forward looking way of thinking of these things than we do in the 21st century. And so I wanted to sort of show that so that people would be clear on the fact that just because we think of it this way doesn't mean this is the absolute fact and the only way to think about these things.
Yeah, that's dope, man. Like this book has so many different layers and levels, especially as it kind of like pertains to masculinity, whether it's the spectrum that you laid it out there, or it's even within the gay, within the queer community. Let me use the proper term for the topic. And I guess I wanted to know, like, how did you see yourself interrogating Black masculinity in this?
What's interesting is patriarchy is a very old system. It's older than white supremacy. It's older than capitalism. With patriarchy, which is this idea that men should rule because we have greater physical strength than other genders, it's a very old idea, and it's also a very flawed idea because not all men can meet that criteria of brute strength. And as men, we're not all that. We are many different things. We can't always be the strongest. We can't always be protectors. We can't always be violent. We can't always be the things that patriarchy expects men to be. Um, and I would say that a lot of the stuff that's surrounding black men's health in terms of, you know, suicidal ideation, um, uh, lifespan, things of that nature, has to do with the pressures that society requires of black men in terms of masculinity. And these ideas of masculinity, if we, you know, go back to the records, go and do the research, these are not wholly African ideas. Much of this, especially when combined with white supremacy and capitalism, are European ideas of European notions of manhood, where we have to, for example, go into places. We form militaries, armies. We go into places. We rape and pillage. We take their stuff, and we do it because we say we can. We can, if we can do it, then you deserve for it to happen to you, and that's what we call a man. James Baldwin used to say, Gary Cooper. You know, we go around rooting for Gary Cooper when the Indian is us. You know, that is what masculinity has become. We call it toxic masculinity, but I don't think it's toxic. I think that's what masculinity is. It's this notion that because I'm stronger than you, I should be able to dominate you. And I wanted to look at other ways of being where a man can be free to not dominate, to be soft, vulnerable, human, and not have to be this sentinel, robot, machine all the time. That, in fact, women could also be strong, dominant, laborious. That there's nothing intrinsic about being a man outside of testosterone that means that we have to be these violent creatures. And so you see that interplay sort of between Samuel and Isaiah and Kosai and Alewa of what's dominant and what's is power to have the ability to have dominion over yourself, or is power to have dominion over other people, and where do those two roads lead you?
Yeah, man. There was just so much I got from this, and I know we're a bit over time that in terms of expected, but there was one more question that I really wanted to ask because it's so really relevant, um, and it's relevant to things that happen today, and it was that incident with Hosea and Samuel fighting after, in a sense, Samuel and Isaiah were outed in quotation mark. And I got two things out of it. And art, that's a good thing about art, right? It's open to so many different interpretations. The one thing I got out of it is that how people can move so differently, and more so, let's say black men could move differently with other black men when they realize that the guy, someone is gay or queer. That's one. And then the other thing is like Hosea, there was a part where you spoke about him having like the erection after the fight, how he was fighting with his own sexuality by fighting Samuel. And that's my interpretation of it. I don't know if you want to give give anything of it, but I just felt like what was that? What was the role of that fight between Samuel and Hosea? What did that represent in this book?
You know, you nailed it. Um, Big Hosea is probably somebody that was struggling with their feelings about other men. Um, Maybe in the past had even acted on those feelings, but once he saw how the tribe, how the community turned against Samuel and Isaiah, retreated back into himself, into the crowd to say, yeah, look at them, so as to take attention off of himself and put it onto someone else. And that happens in real life. The idea of internalized anti-queerness is strong. It's very strong. I know so many queer people especially Black men, who are so full of self-loathing that they hate other queer men more maybe than, you know, some straight people. It is that's, you know, the goal of any oppression is to make you hate yourself so much that you start doing the work of the oppressor, and the oppressor could just stand back and watch. They don't have to do any work. And that's kind of what you see in that interaction with Hosea and Samuel, which a lot of people miss that
Yeah.
part. They don't make the connection that you made. That here's this guy who attacked Samuel, but yet he has an erection. Like, what does that mean? What is that? What is Hosea actually fighting?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Whew. Yeah, listen, there's a lot more, but I think I'm gonna let people see in this video actually like come up with their own interpretation, because that's what art is. Art is, you know, art. Only the artist knows what he means, and everybody else interprets it.
Some
So
might say what the artist thinks doesn't even matter,
yeah,
because it's what you bring to the work that matters.
precisely. So I don't know, Rob, if you want to say something in closing, you know.
Um, David Wells, one of my best friends in the world, thank you so much for having me. Father of my godson. Um, I look very much forward to coming on the campus and speaking with everyone in person about the prophets. Thank you to the Brooklyn College community for embracing this work, because I was terrified that nobody would. And thank you so much for deep diving with me on these topics. I really truly appreciate it.